Okay, let's unpack this. Have you ever found yourself maybe in a debate listening to someone make this incredibly compelling argument, and you just paused and wondered, am I being swayed by, the actual truth here, or is it just brilliant rhetoric? Or maybe you've been the one trying to convince people, and you knew that framing the facts, well, framing them just right, could be way more effective than just listing them out. Today, we're taking a deep dive into a really fascinating, often misunderstood, and profoundly influential group from ancient Greece, the Sophists. And we'll focus particularly on their sort of chief figure, Protagoras. Our mission today is to cut through centuries of bias, the popular misconceptions, to try and understand what they really stood for. And we'll be grounding this in the rich historical sources you've brought along.
Yeah, and what's so fascinating here is exactly how these sources let us peel back those layers of interpretation, layers that have built up over, well, millennia. We're looking at excerpts from a history of Western philosophy, and they specifically shed light on how Protagoras and his contemporaries influenced, not just philosophy, but also the kind of gritty realities of politics and even the very idea of truth itself back then. So we'll trace their journey from being these highly respected educators, almost cultural innovators, you could say, to becoming figures of really intense controversy. Our exploration is going to delve into everything from the practical skills they taught rhetoric, public speaking, right through to their deep philosophical controversies. And all of this is happening within the, let's face it, turbulent political backdrop of 5th century Athens. It's genuinely a journey into some foundational ideas about how we understand knowledge, persuasion, and yeah, even what it means to be well informed.
Okay, so let's start right there with the word itself, sophist. When you hear sophist today, it almost always has that negative ring to it, doesn't it? It makes you think of a trickster, maybe, someone using clever words, but without real integrity or truth behind them. But our sources show a pretty dramatic shift in how that word was perceived. It wasn't always like that, was it?
No, not at all. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the historical etymology, the original meaning of sophist was actually remarkably neutral, maybe even positive in a broad sense. The sources are incredibly clear here. Originally, the word sophist had absolutely no negative meaning attached. None. It simply meant professor, or, as one text puts it quite precisely, a wise man who made his living by teaching young men certain things that it was thought would be useful to them in practical life. It was a totally legitimate professional calling in 5th century Greece, a recognized, even respected profession. These guys were essentially the advanced educators of their time, offering learning that just didn't exist in any public state-funded way. The whole negative shift, where it eventually got tied up with bad connotations or being like a bad professor who misleads people, that really only took hold much later. And it was significantly pushed by their philosophical opponents, Plato most famously. But in their prime, highly regarded, highly skilled instructors meeting a very real need in society.
That's a really crucial distinction to make right off the bat. So, if they were so highly regarded initially, what exactly were they teaching? What was in this curriculum that made it so useful, so essential for these young men? The sources seem to really hammer home the practicality, not just abstract thinking.
Precisely. This wasn't about sitting in an ivory tower contemplating the universe. It was intensely practical. They taught skills like speech, and we're not just talking about, clear pronunciation. Our sources explain that many students paid specifically for instruction in the arts required for success in the law courts, exentia. Now, you have to picture Athenian society. It was a direct democracy. Citizens were expected to participate actively. And there weren't professional lawyers like we have today.
Yeah.
If you got accused of something or you needed to bring a case against someone, you stood up in front of a massive jury, sometimes hundreds, maybe even thousands of your fellow citizens, and you argued your own case. That required more than just knowing the facts. It demanded the ability to build a persuasive argument, to use rhetoric effectively, anticipate the other side, basically to sway a crowd. And the Sophists, they gave their students those tools. They taught argumentation techniques, strategies for crafting a compelling story, how to structure a speech, even how to spot and exploit weaknesses in an opponent's case. They were essentially giving them the whole toolkit needed to be successful and influential in public life, whether in the assembly, a political debate, or defending themselves in court. This really made them profound cultural innovators because they were directly responding to a huge demand for practical knowledge that could lead to success and influence within that unique Athenian system. Their courses were specifically designed, as the source says, to provide things thought would be useful to them in practical life. This relentless practical focus is absolutely key to understanding why they were initially so popular and accepted.
Okay, and here's where it gets really compelling, I think, where we start seeing some of those underlying social dynamics, the
Right.
stuff that maybe later fed into their controversial reputation. Our source is very clear. This was private education, entirely private. There was no public provision for such education, which almost inevitably tended to give them a certain class bias.
Well,
Because, well, pretty simply, only the people who could afford the fees got access. So this wasn't an education for just anybody, right?
That's a critical insight, absolutely. And it really highlights a major socioeconomic dimension of their work. Education like this was a commodity, and a very valuable one at that. It was primarily accessible to the wealthy elite. These were often the rich who embodied what appears to us as Hellenic culture, and by Hellenic culture we mean that vibrant, intellectual, artistic world of ancient Greece, philosophy, art, emerging democracy. These were the folks with the leisure time, the resources for education, travel, engaging in intellectual stuff. So, while the Sophist skills were undeniably valuable and useful across the board, Cubby offering this private fee-based teaching, they did, perhaps inadvertently, contribute to a kind of social layering. It created a gap between those who could afford the tools of persuasion and those who couldn't. But interestingly, despite this built-in class bias, the Sophists became incredibly politically triumphant, especially right there in Athens. This was a city where democracy wasn't just an idea, it was flourishing and public-speaking persuasive argument. These weren't just handy skills, they were essential for getting ahead. Think about the Athenian assembly, thousands of citizens gathered to debate and vote on laws. Having personal influence there, or being able to win over a jury in court, that was real power. So the Sophist services were in super high demand because they met this fundamental, practical need in a society where rhetorical skill was literally the path to civic and personal success. The sources even make a fascinating comparison, noting that while Sophists were politically powerful in Athens, they were politically weaker in America than they were in Athens.
right.
Which probably reflects our different political structures, professional lawyers, elected reps doing a lot of the talking, unlike the direct citizen involvement in Athens.
That context makes so much sense. It paints this picture of a society just hungry for what they offered. Our sources then lead us straight into the age of Pericles. Now, that's a period often romanticized, isn't it? The golden age of Athens. But the sources suggest things weren't quite as, golden as they might seem. And it seems clear the Sophists' rise, and maybe their later struggles too, were deeply tangled up with these bigger societal shifts.
Oh, absolutely. Athens under Pericles was undeniably rich and powerful, no question. And it had what our sources call a democratic constitution administered by aristocrats. Bit of a paradox there, maybe. It was a time of incredible intellectual and artistic energy, a real beacon of culture. But this golden age definitely had its deep shadows. Our sources detail some truly devastating challenges that really tested the city. The Peloponnesian War, that massive drawn-out conflict with Sparta and its allies, kicked off in 431 BC, and this wasn't some far-off war. It was an existential fight that hit every part of Athenian life, its culture, its politics, its stability. Then, just a couple years later, 429 BC, a horrific plague swept through Athens. This wasn't just a bad flu season, it was a demographic catastrophe. Our sources note it wiped out a significant chunk of the population, and it almost certainly didn't bounce back to its former level for a very, very long time. Just imagine the psychological impact, the loss of skilled people, the disruption. It was immense. And Pericles himself, the great leader, tragically died from this plague along with his two legitimate sons. That left a huge leadership vacuum, making an already stressed city even more unstable. So these events really ushered in a period of intense social and political turmoil. It created a climate just ripe for suspicion, for scapegoating. The sources vividly describe this climate of shifting political and social allegiances. For instance, Phidias, the famous sculptor associated with Pericles and the Parthenon, condemned. Anaxagoras, a leading philosopher, Pericles' own teacher, condemned for impiety. Even Aspasia, Pericles' brilliant partner, faced prosecution. This shows a really chilling shift. Even top figures could suddenly fall victim to accusations. It reflects this growing societal anxiety, a climate where traditional morals and religious beliefs could be easily weaponized, especially in times of crisis. And this created an incredibly difficult environment for people like the Sophists, who, by their very nature, encouraged questioning conventional wisdom, promoting new ways of thinking, which could easily look subversive in such volatile times.
Right. So despite their obvious practical usefulness in that democratic setup, the Sophists clearly started attracting a lot of heat. Why was that happening? Was it purely their challenging ideas, or was something deeper going on that led to this, well, bad reputation?
It seems like it was a really complex mix of things. Our sources do point to a natural hostility of democratic politicians towards them, but it wasn't always about their philosophy in some abstract, purely academic way. They faced really serious accusations, most famously impiety, disrespecting the gods, and maybe even more damaging, corrupting the young. That double whammy gave them a very bad reputation in Athens. The criticism often seemed to stem from this perception that, okay, while they taught skills for success, in their own minds they served more impersonal purposes than just, say, the good of the city or upholding traditional values. Essentially, they were seen as teaching how to argue effectively, even if the argument itself wasn't necessarily virtuous or, true in the traditional sense. They were prepared, as the source says, almost like modern lawyers, to show how to argue for or against any opinion.
Mm-hmm.
And this ability, the skill to argue both sides, maybe even make the weaker argument sound stronger, that was seen by some as actively undermining objective truth and moral standards. This focus on forensic skill, on questioning assumptions, it directly clashed with deeply held traditional Athenian values, with the established social order. For many people, especially the more conservative types, the Sophists' teachings looked like they were eroding the very foundations of accepted wisdom, ethical norms, maybe even religious faith. They were seen as undermining ancient beliefs and, kind of ironically, potentially damaging the very democracy they were equipping people to participate in, precisely because their methods encouraged critical thinking about things that were just conventionally accepted. This created this huge intellectual societal tension, and that ultimately fueled their controversial status and the negative baggage that, over time, got stuck to the name Sophist. It's a classic case, really, of how innovation, when it bumps up against deeply held norms, can easily be seen as a threat.
That makes perfect sense. Okay, let's zoom in now on Protagoras himself. He's often called the chief figure among the Sophists. Who was this guy? What do we know about his background, his early career, before he became so famous for these, revolutionary ideas?
Protagoras was quite a character, it seems. Born around 500 BC in Abdera, that's a city in Thrace. Interestingly, it's also connected to Democritus, the philosopher known for atomic theory. So he came out of an intellectually vibrant place, and his early career really shows that strong practical bent, which is such a hallmark of Sophist teaching. Our sources mention that he made a code of laws for the city of Thurii in 44 and 43 BC. Now, that's not just theorizing, that's a major contribution to a real-world political community. It shows he wasn't just a thinker, but someone involved in actually structuring society, a civic architect, in a way. But his career also really highlights the dangers of challenging traditional beliefs in Athens, especially about religion. He famously faced prosecution for impiety. The sources point specifically to his book On the Gods. And in it, he wrote this passage that became absolutely central to his skepticism. I think I should quote it directly. With regard to the gods, I cannot feel sure that they are or that they are not, nor what they are like in figure, for there are many things that hinder sure knowledge, the obscurity of the subject and the shortness of human life. Now notice, that's not a flat-out denial of the gods, which might have been more common, maybe. It's more an admission of the fundamental limits of what humans can know about divine stuff. But in a deeply religious society, where public piety was kind of expected, even this intellectual honesty, this perceived agnosticism, was enough to trigger serious accusations, and eventually led to him having to flee Athens. That whole episode just perfectly sums up the tension between free inquiry and societal conservatism in that really charged period.
Okay, this is where it gets truly fascinating, and what Protagoras is maybe most famous for today. That groundbreaking statement, man is the measure of all things. For us listening now, what does that actually mean? How does that idea just fundamentally change the game when it comes to understanding truth?
Right. This statement is the absolute core of his philosophy, and its implications are huge, even for us today. The full statement, as we have it from the sources, is, man is the measure of all things, of things that they are, and of things that are not that they are not. What this basically says is that truth isn't objective, it's not universal, it's not external somewhere. Instead, truth is inherently subjective. It varies entirely from person to person based on their individual perception, their experience, their judgment. So if something seems true to you, then for you it is true. If it seems true to me, then for me it is true. It's a radical break from the idea of a single, fixed, objective reality that everyone can or should agree on. It shifts the judge of truth from some external authority or universal principle, right down to the individual human being. And to make this concrete, our source gives a really relatable example. If a man has jaundice, he really may not yellow, but the color they look to a man in health. Think about that. If someone with jaundice sees everything with a yellow tint, that's their genuine lived reality. That's how the world appears to them. A healthy person, looking at the exact same scene, sees colors differently. According to Protagoras, both perceptions are true for the person perceiving them. Neither person is inherently wrong from their own subjective viewpoint. However, and this is the crucial bit that sometimes gets missed, Protagoras takes it a critical step further. He adds, "We can say, however, that since health is better than sickness, the opinion of the man in health is better than that of the man who has jaundice." Now, this addition is absolutely vital. While all perceptions might be true for the individual experiencing them, some experiences or states like being healthy versus being sick are objectively better or more desirable for human well-being, and this leads straight into what scholars often call his good is better than truth doctrine. For Protagoras, practical benefit or utility often trumped absolute objective truth. It wasn't always about whether something was absolutely true in some unchanging universal sense, but more about whether it was beneficial, useful, or advantageous to the individual or to society. So if a certain belief or a social custom or a law helped promote social order, public good, individual well-being, even if you couldn't definitively prove its ultimate absolute truth, then it was considered a better belief to hold, a better way to act. This deep pragmatism is really a defining feature of his thinking. It emphasizes utility, lived experience, social harmony, maybe over abstract ideals of absolute truth that might be impossible to reach anyway. It's not just anything goes, it's really a prioritization of human flourishing.
That distinction, that good is better than truth, rather than just a free-for-all, that seems incredibly important. So what does this all mean then for bedrock concepts like objective truth or even morality? If man is the measure, and what's better sometimes takes precedence over what's strictly true. It sounds like a deeply skeptical approach, but also a very pragmatic one.
His doctrine is, at its heart, essentially skeptical, especially about objective truth, and particularly in moral and ethical areas. If truth is relative to each person's perception, then the whole idea of universal, unchanging moral truths becomes really difficult to sustain, doesn't it? For Protagoras, knowledge wasn't something you pursued just for its own sake, like some abstract academic game. Instead, he believed knowledge was truly valuable only when it was understood and applied, when it led to practical efficiency and what he termed higher mental culture. This means the real worth of ideas was in their concrete, practical use, their ability to actually improve human life and society. It's a very results-focused philosophy. And this pragmatic view definitely shaped his nuanced take on the gods. As we mentioned, he didn't necessarily endorse their existence or nature definitively. He acknowledged the obscurity of the subject and the shortness of human life as basically insurmountable obstacles to knowing for sure. Yet the sources strongly suggest he believed that belief in such things in gods, in traditional morality, was incredibly useful. Useful for promoting social order, for maintaining traditional morality. Even if their ultimate truth couldn't be proven, if believing in the gods helped societies function smoothly, kept civic order, encouraged good behavior, well, then that belief served a really valuable purpose. This gave a practical foundation for law and social convention, even while he held on to his theoretical skepticism about ultimate knowledge. This perspective, as one source puts it, would be surely the right one to a man whose theoretical skepticism is thoroughgoing and logical. It allowed him to engage with real-world problems and offer practical solutions without ever ditching his core philosophical stance on the limits of human knowing. It's also worth remembering that Protagoras spent his adult life in a sort of perpetual lecture tour through the cities of Greece, teaching, for a fee, anyone who desired practical efficiency and higher mental culture. He wasn't just thinking this stuff up, he was actively out there spreading this pragmatic approach to knowledge to anyone willing to pay and learn.
Okay, so given all this, their focus on practical skills, questioning objective truth, this pragmatic approach to morality, were the Sophists really philosophers in the way we usually think of them? Like Plato or Aristotle, seeking universal truths, eternal forms, or were they something else entirely? The sources seem to draw a pretty sharp line, almost setting the stage for a big intellectual showdown.
Yes, the sources are very clear on that distinction, and it's absolutely crucial for understanding their legacy and the arguments they stirred up. They state explicitly, among the Sophists, there was none of this. What they had to teach was not, in their minds, connected with religion or virtue. They taught the art of arguing and as much knowledge as would help in this art, unquote. That's a key point of difference. Unlike later philosophers who really dedicated themselves to defining virtue, knowledge, truth as these objective, discoverable realities, the Sophists were primarily focused on practical, persuasive skills. They were, in essence, professional teachers of rhetoric, masters of public discourse. They were equipped, as the source says, to show how to argue for or against any opinion, much like a modern lawyer learns to present a case effectively from different perspectives. Their main goal was practical effectiveness cleverness and persuasion, achieving success in public life, not necessarily chasing some abstract universal truth just for its own sake. And this highly pragmatic, often relativistic approach inevitably meant they clashed not only with the general public, but with Plato and subsequent philosophers. This really highlights their significant, lasting impact on philosophical debate precisely because they directly challenge the very foundations of what philosophy should be about and how truth should even be sought. They were ready to follow an argument wherever it might logically lead them, which often meant prioritizing a rhetorical win or a beneficial practical outcome over what later philosophers would define as objective truth or inherent virtue. This fundamental difference really set the stage for one of the biggest intellectual battles in Western thought, the clash between seeking absolute truth versus mastering persuasive communication.
And our sources definitely illustrate that direct, often quite fiery, conflict between the Sophists and Plato. Plato being this towering figure many of us know as foundational to Western philosophy, what was the absolute core of their disagreement? It sounds like more than just a difference of opinion. It feels like a battle for the soul of intellectual life itself.
You're absolutely right. It was a fundamental clash of worldviews, a deep philosophical, even moral disagreement. Plato famously and repeatedly criticized the Sophists in his dialogues, often painting them as intellectual opportunists, maybe even charlatans. Our sources capture their core difference perfectly. Plato believed that virtue is knowledge and that the truth will turn out to be what is thought edifying in a given society. The Sophists were prepared to follow an argument wherever it might lead them. That just highlights the huge gap between them. Plato, deeply influenced by Socrates' search for universal definitions, was chasing this realm of objective, unchanging forms, ideals of goodness, beauty, justice, truth. He believed genuine knowledge and virtue were absolute. They could be discovered. And that true virtue could only come from true knowledge. A just society for him had to be built on these absolute truths. The Sophists, on the other hand, especially Protagoras with his man as the measure idea, were fundamentally skeptical about that kind of objective truth, particularly in human affairs. They focused on the practical use of persuasive rhetoric, the utility of arguments in specific situations. Plato, especially in dialogues like Gorgias, argued passionately that the Sophists lacked real logical rigor, that their methods, while persuasive, ultimately led down a slippery slope to moral relativism, eroding civic virtue. He saw them as prioritizing winning an argument or getting a practical advantage over seeking genuine justice or truth. For Plato, the Sophists, even though they were intellectually sharp and masters of rhetoric, were dangerous precisely because they were prepared to follow an argument wherever it might lead them, without being anchored necessarily in an objective, moral, or intellectual framework. They could make the weaker argument appear stronger, which, in Plato's view, was a profound threat to both society and the pursuit of true wisdom.
And this whole intellectual clash was playing out against this incredibly dramatic backdrop. The major historical upheaval and eventual decline of Athens itself. Was there a connection there? Between these intense philosophical debates and the turbulent political climate, it almost feels like the decline of Athens might have been related to, or at least mirrored by, some of these intellectual challenges to traditional ways of thinking.
Oh, absolutely. There's a strong, undeniable link, almost a symbiotic relationship between the intellectual ferment and the societal decay, you could say. The 5th century BC was just a period of immense, rapid, often violent change for Athens. It started with that triumphant period, didn't it? Decisive victories like Marathon, Salamis. Athens became this powerful naval empire, a real golden age. But that triumph was tragically followed by a series of absolutely devastating conflicts, especially that long, drawn-out Peloponnesian War starting in 431 BC. And like we said, this wasn't just a military thing. It was an existential struggle that deeply affected Athenian society, its culture, its political structure, its very soul. The war brought this cascade of disasters that just shattered Athenian confidence and traditional values. Our sources mention the disastrous Sicilian expedition in 414 BC, a huge military blunder that crippled Athens' resources and morale. This was followed by really brutal acts like the massacre at Melos, which highlighted this growing ruthlessness, maybe a moral erosion in Athenian policy. A kind of pragmatic might makes right attitude that, some might see as a dark reflection of sophistic pragmatism. Ultimately, Athens lost the war, and that led to the devastating installation of that oligarchic government, the 30 Tyrants, in 404 BC. This regime, backed by Sparta, was incredibly harsh, oppressive, and ironically, it included figures like Critias, who had actually been one of Socrates' pupils. This period marks a profound shift away from the democratic ideals that had, in part, fueled the Sophists' influence. The very foundations of Athenian society were cracking under the strain of war, plague, internal political chaos. And the ultimate cultural shift reflecting this whole tumultuous period and its intellectual anxieties is really powerfully underlined by the sources. In 399 BC, the trial and death of Socrates took place. That was a truly pivotal, tragic moment. Socrates, though philosophically different from the Sophists, was often unfairly lumped in with them by the public. Why? Because he relentlessly questioned traditional norms and he hung out with wealthy, influential young men. His condemnation officially for impiety and corrupting the young really reflects a society grappling with deep instability, a growing suspicion of any intellectual inquiry that challenged the status quo. In that climate of fear and uncertainty, the sophistic ideas questioning established truths, prioritizing practical persuasion, even embracing a kind of subjective reality, well, they might have seemed particularly dangerous or subversive. They could easily be perceived as contributing to this broader cultural unease that ultimately played a part in the fall of Athens, and also in the subsequent shift in intellectual focus towards the more absolute, stable truth championed by figures like Plato. It's a powerful reminder, isn't it, that philosophical ideas are never really separate from the societies they spring from.
Wow. What an incredible journey through ancient Greek thought and society. We started by really peeling back the layers on the term sophist, didn't we? Discovering their original meaning as these highly respected teachers, offering practical, truly essential skills for navigating Athenian democracy. Then we saw how figures like Protagoras championed this revolutionary subjective view of truth, famously declaring man is the measure of all things, and crucially prioritizing what was better or more beneficial for human society, maybe even over some elusive objective truth. And we've explored how these ideas clashed really dramatically with the search for universal, absolute truths by philosophers like Plato. All of this set against that profound, often brutal backdrop of a declining Athenian empire.
Yeah, and this whole deep dive really raises an important question for us today, doesn't it? What does that man is the measure doctrine mean for how you, listening now, understand truth in your own life? I mean, in our modern age, we're overloaded with information, different perspectives, constantly vying for attention. We hear terms like alternative facts, post-truth. It's alarmingly common. Understanding the Sophists' approach to knowledge, to persuasion, even to these better truths, it can offer incredibly powerful insights, I think. They were grappling with fundamental questions. What is knowledge? How do we get it? How do we convince others? How do we build a functioning society? These are questions that are just as relevant, maybe even more relevant, in our super connected, often polarized world today. Their emphasis on practical application, on the art of argument, on the utility of belief, even if it led to accusations of dangerous relativism, it forces us to think deeply about the purpose and the real-world impact of our own communication, our own convictions.
So the next time you hear a really powerful argument, or maybe you find yourself trying to persuade someone to see things your way, just take a moment maybe to consider this enduring legacy of the Sophists. Is it always about finding the one single absolute truth? Or is there sometimes a valid practical wisdom in simply making the most compelling case for what is demonstrably better or more beneficial in a particular situation? It really makes you think about how we navigate our world, doesn't it? Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and most importantly, keep getting well informed.